Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars, hosted live from Saïd Business School. This is the briefing. Last month saw the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and the below-market sale of Credit Suisse, and earlier this month the IMF warned the global economy is set for years of weak growth. We polled our journalist fellows to ask what they thought the most important role of business journalists was during times of financial crisis. 28.6% said providing accurate information. 42.9% said shaping public perception of economic events. 28.6% said holding those in power to account. Our guest for the seminar is Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, who has spent decades studying and writing about the global economy. He's a strong advocate for transparency and accountability in the financial sector and a vocal proponent of the role that the media can play in promoting these values. We're live from the Nelson Mandela Lecture Theatre at Saïd Business School. That's the briefing. Let's begin.
That's my cue. Well, hello and welcome to everyone who is gathered in the room, and hello and welcome to our online audience. It's a pleasure to have you here. It's a pleasure to be having this conversation. It's interesting on the words that you said about how things look quite stark at this point in the economic environment. And I was having a conversation with a colleague yesterday where he pointed to a piece of unpublished research in Denmark, where the researcher went on to study what a journalist meant when they said, never before in our lifetime. And he came to the conclusion that it was probably roughly somewhere in the range of 18 months. Sometimes I think it might be shorter, but safe to say, having been a business journalist for most of my career as well, there is a certain repetitive and scary boom-bust pattern to what we've been seeing in terms of our reportage. I think it's been accentuated since the global financial crisis. Those cycles have gotten shorter, more intense, more scary, and it really is a moment of reckoning, I think, not just for financial journalists, but for journalists at large in terms of both comprehending the scale of what's happening, and I think more importantly, bringing that to an audience to understand what's real for them. Two things stand out from the landscape that we look at this point. One, the fact that the economic collapse is being felt at a very personal level. Food inflation, cost of living, this has become a very personal economic crisis for people across the world. And in this, there is no global south-north divide, perhaps accentuated, of course, but felt by all. And second, the fact that climate change is now no longer a glamorous sidebar conversation. It's not something that the privileged talk about. It's affecting us at an economic, social, political level, whether you're an organization, a community, or a country. Some of that is what we're going to talk about. And of course, much of what we will talk about is what do we do as journalists, as thinkers, as economy watchers in terms of raising the bar on conversations and really raising awareness. It is my absolute honor and privilege to welcome our guest today, Joseph Stiglitz. He's an Indiana boy, but he's been a couple of places since then, for the last 2 decades with Columbia, but previously at many organizations, including Princeton, Stanford, MIT, and our very own All Souls at Oxford, isn't it? So we can lay claim that you're a bit of a local boy as well. Much of his work has frankly been seminal, for lack of a better word, both in terms of climate change, in terms of inequity, in terms of economic patterns. And I think what intrigued me is that some of Joseph's books have account of both how many are sold in the pirated and the non-pirated copies. I'm not sure how many economists and non-fiction writers can lay claim to that kind of badge, but it is a badge. Joseph, such a pleasure and a warm, warm welcome to you again. Thank you for speaking to our community. Let me start, since your landscape is more than 18 months, in terms of what you see around you at this point and how you would describe this moment that we're living in as an economic construct in 23.
Well, I mean, I guess I would begin by just observing that, we've had some very big shocks of the kind that don't happen very often. COVID-19, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and in a way, we should be a little bit proud of how we've managed our way through these difficult things. The ability to produce a vaccine in record time is a true scientific achievement. And the fact that we were able not only to discover the pathogen, develop the vaccine, but produce it is again a big achievement of, you might say, of economics. The fact that we wound up with vaccine apartheid and that only some people got the vaccine, we could get many of the shocks as we wanted in the West, but not in the developing countries, is a real failure of globalization and something that I think will have a very big geopolitical consequence and represents sort of the darker side of capitalism. The drug companies have worked very hard to make billions of dollars off of public research money and keep the vaccines away from and the therapeutics away from poor countries. So I mean, this is really scandalous in my mind. And if you were living in a developing countries, this would be part of the reality that you would be facing, and the memory that you would be facing. The other side of this, as you mentioned, is the economic consequences of both of those two events, COVID-19 and the war. Again, enormous achievement in the advanced countries, initially preventing what could have been a disastrous economic outcome, a real depression. We managed it worse in the United States than in other countries in terms of unemployment. Our unemployment spiked to 15%, which is, the official unemployment. So that's really enormous. But we were able to maintain our GDP, our overall income, and to protect most Americans. But that was not, again, true in the developing countries. So we had learned a lot about economic management, but we were a little bit selfish in terms of we did it for ourselves, but not for the others. But the point that you made about inflation, to me, again, reflects the fact that, both the weaknesses in our economy, supply chains broke down, car companies forgot to order chips, and they couldn't
access them.
Well, that was partly good. They didn't have, but they couldn't access the chips. And so it's not because we didn't know how to make cars. We had the factories, but we just, for one little thing, we couldn't make cars, and that led to prices soaring. I had warned, many other people had warned, the dangers of being so dependent on Russian gas. I talked about it in my book, Making Globalization Work, more than 15 years ago, that it was foolish to be so dependent on Russia, which was clearly not a reliable trade partner. And yet, Germany went ahead, and in my mind, a sign of real corruption. Schroeder, who was the German chancellor who signed these agreements, winds up on the chairman of the board of Gazprom. I mean, you talk about corruption. And now we're feeling the consequence of that. But the 2 points I'd make on all of this is, one of them, Europe's response in terms of electricity pricing was disastrous. It was wedded to a particular regulatory model that had already shown itself to be deficient, but led to huge spikes in profits and prices at huge cost. So that was a man-made disaster. I mean, we couldn't stop Russia from invading. I mean, but what we did to ourselves by this flawed regulatory model, I think, is something that we ought to be rethinking of how we run our economy. But the other thing is we discovered that more broadly that our economy wasn't very resilient. The private sector wasn't very resilient. It was excessively short-sighted, wasn't able to respond adequately to the shock. It was partly things like just-in-time inventories made the economy less resilient. And now, just to extend my gripe a little bit, I think the central banks have been responding very foolishly, raising interest rates. When you ask the question, you have a shortage of oil, shortage of energy, is the way to, or food is the way, increasing interest rates produce more food or more energy or more chips? It'll do just the opposite. It'll make it more difficult to make the investments.
Yeah.
So the central banks are really exacerbating the problems, and led by the Federal Reserve in the United States, and creating risk of financial turmoil, and not even taking that into account, the consequences in their regulatory and supervisory activities. So to me, the central banks or behavior is just almost incredible how badly they've been behaving.
So as a former business journalist, in my head, I'm thinking, okay, this is the lead in your answer, and then I'm moving to another lead where it's moving from inefficient governments to inefficient central banks to geopolitics. But let me pick up on the very first point that you made, Joseph, around inequities that existed around the vaccine, and they did, including the fact that in many of these developing countries, testing was carried out, but then access to vaccines wasn't as may I say, generous. We emerged from COVID, thinking we'd sort of been through this crisis and we hadn't done too badly, but we also emerged from this crisis quite inequitous. And Oxfam report itself points to the fact that only 1% of the very rich amassed about 2/3 of the wealth that was generated at that period. Do you think that was sort of a turning point, or do you think some of this was the seeds of what had been sowed in the previous decades? Because you have alluded to that in one of your books around the period of the 90s, where you said a lot of bad calls were made and we're going to pay the price for it.
Yeah, no, it's clear that what has been going on, is a continuation of that growing inequality. Some of it's reflecting growing monopoly power. During COVID-19, what we saw was that market power markups, profits, increased enormously. And one of the major sources of inflation was this market power, that prices increased more in sectors and among firms where there was more market power. So we saw in the midst of this terrible tumult, market power got exercised more, and that, of course, leads to more inequality. So we had the underlying COVID-19 both reflecting and exacerbating existing inequalities. And then we had the market response exacerbating those inequalities. And then globally, as you say, the vaccine apartheid. And it's not only vaccine, it's the therapeutics, the tests, which are continuing the discussion over the WTO policies having changed. And so that kind of, you might say, COVID-19 apartheid is continuing.
Yeah. And it's happening against a fairly regular pace of toxic blow-ups that are happening within the financial system. I mean, we lived through it during the Lehman crisis, and now we saw it during the SVB collapse as well. And if I may take the liberty of quoting a piece that you wrote about the SVB collapse, saying, SVB represents more than the failure of a single bank. It is emblematic of deep failures in the conduct of regulatory and monetary policy. Just like the 2008 crisis, it was predictable and predicted. Are we learning any lessons at all?
Well, you say, are we? The question is, who is the we?
Them.
So I am amazed at the fact that Federal Reserve Board has not learned the lessons. Not a surprise. Let me say, there were big divisions within the Federal Reserve Board. And, for instance, between the chair and the vice chair is now left. But the chair comes from the financial markets. He was appointed by President Trump. So it's not a little surprising, some of his views. He thought that we don't need regulation. And, admittedly, 2008 was how long ago?
Not too long at all.
Oh, for distant memory, more than 18 months, as you were saying. That's a distant memory. So by the time he got appointed, we no longer needed financial regulation, he thought. And he went ahead and weakened the regulation on the regional banks like SVB. Yeah. So he got Congress to deregulate, but then in implementation, he went further than he had to. So Silicon Valley Bank was basically not put under the close scrutiny. This is important. You mentioned this place as an entrepreneurial school. Silicon Valley Bank lent money to half the startups in the country and had deposits from half the startups. And I felt it very intensely, as I mentioned in that article, because my daughter is one of these Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. She is a CEO of a firm in ed tech, as they call it. And all the money that her firm had, they'd just done what they call the second round of raising money. All the money was in the Silicon Valley Bank. And she called me up on the Thursday. It went down on Friday afternoon at noon. She called me up on Thursday and she said, I try to get my money out and they won't give me my money back. And it was, in the millions. And Friday morning, she said, I still can't get my money out. And what's going to happen? I said, well, it's going to go bankrupt. And
I'm your dad, and I am telling you.
But don't worry. In the end, they will fix it. You'll get your money back. But she went through a terrible weekend because it wasn't until Sunday night that they announced that, and the Fed was trying to, even fighting at the last minute. We don't want to be blamed for anything. We don't want to take any of the accountability. We're mentioning accountability. We don't want to. The fact is that, and then in the aftermath of this, it's really amazing. We found out not only did they have bad regulation, they had bad supervision. So you may have heard about that we do stress tests on banks. We discovered.
That was born during the global financial crisis,
exactly.
saying, hey, let's do this. Yeah.
And then we discovered they didn't know what stress meant. And you're supposed to be the regulator. You're supposed to know about banking. And they thought, and this is something I had upset me 20 years ago in the SNL crisis in the late 1980s. They thought because the Silicon Valley Bank had their money in government bonds that there's no risk. But if you have long-term government bonds and the Fed itself is raising interest rates, it knows that the price of long-term bonds is going down. And that was the problem with Silicon Valley Bank. So they didn't even test for the stress that they were imposing on the banks that they're supposed to be supervising. And then, of course, they didn't know that there were some problems, but they didn't do anything about it. Yeah. So I think this is an amazing story of regulatory failure and the failure of the Federal Reserve. One more point about it, it also certainly undermined confidence in governance, because the head of the Silicon Valley Bank was on the Federal Reserve Board of San Francisco that regulated it, supervised it. And that was a question that had also been raised in the 2008 crisis. And we said, you know, this is a little bit peculiar, more than peculiar, way of running oversight. And they did a little bit about it, but clearly not enough.
This is a good point for me to sort of pivot to the role of journalists, particularly for two keywords that you used. One, accountability, which is something we should wear as a badge, and the other, lack of confidence, which is something we are also facing as a community. And it's often tough to be a journalist when you're up against such a thick and strong wall of money. But equally, I guess it's tough to be a business journalist when you're sitting very close to the people who you want to get that information from, whether it's organizations or policy heads, or frankly, a stock market tip. How do you steer yourself in times like these? And what do you think journalists should think about? In the sense, is it very different from what they should have thought about 20 years back?
Yeah, well, so I think there's one more aspect that I would call attention to, which is there are some sources of information that are easy to get and some that are more difficult. And, you know, resources are always limited, and one of the resources that's limited is your time. And so the banks are out there feeding you information all the time. The business community is feeding you information all the time. How wonderful they are, don't worry, the risks are low. The Federal Reserve is coming out all the time saying, you know, 3 days before Silicon Valley Bank goes down, the Federal Reserve issues a statement, everything is fine in America's banking system. They've just issued another kind of thing. There's a run against First Republic today, or, you know, so those are things that are going on all the time, and they're giving you assurances. I think, you know, this sounds self-serving, but you ought to talk to academics more. Because there are today a lot of academics who actually are studying these issues. They're at a disadvantage. They don't have the data that the Federal Reserve does, and they don't have the data that a business. But on the other hand, they have a kind of a greater impartiality, and they play an important role as a critic. So, for instance, there was a study coming out of Stanford on what was happening to the balance sheets of banks. Yeah. And it gives a very different picture than you get from the Federal Reserve. It points out that when the Fed raised the interest rate so quickly and the value of the bonds went down, they went down and calculated how many banks were in a fragile position. You read their paper and you come out worried. Yeah. And, you know, if I think, you know, the press had gotten a hold of that paper more strongly and gone to the Fed and started asking them questions, how do you reconcile your confidence that the banking system is nothing to worry about with these studies? I think that's part of the way you can get greater accountability.
Are they doing at all what they should be doing in terms of climate accountability, Joseph? Because that's the tough one. It's a new one. It's new domain, to be fair, for many people. But already with accountability coming in, we're hearing of greenwashing coming in quite quickly on the heels of it.
Well, I think, I mean, overall, I think climate reporting has been quite good.
We're talking to the academics.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I think it really has. I mean, I've actually something I've been looking at, and I think most of the media, and I'm talking not just about the Guardian, but New York Times, even though Wall Street Journal, do report the disasters, and they do relate those natural disasters to climate change. And so I think that part of the coverage, I think, has been pretty good. It's hard because these have, you probably know as a journalist, you can't write the same story over and over again because climate change, it's one disaster after another, and you almost get inured to it. And how do you keep people engaged in something where it keeps happening is a real challenge, and I don't know the answer to that. So the overall climate reporting, I think, is not bad. I don't know how I would do a better job of engagement, but I mean, clearly it's a real challenge. Holding individual companies to account, though, I think they could do a better job. And it's not just, greenwashing, talking about, how individual companies are contributing to worsening the climate, sort of getting down into the culpability of particular firms, and
how it's odd that sometimes some of them fortuitously manage to be sponsors for COP summits.
Exactly,
Sure
the hypocrisy that is pervasive. And greenwashing is a good story because it is an example of hypocrisy that you see often, but it's much more pervasive. And I'm actually, some of the companies that are trying to do good, even if they don't do it perfectly, I feel better about those in some ways than those who don't even try. Because somehow I think I'm actually optimistic if you keep talking about it, eventually it affects behavior. Now, I think that there can be a little bit more engagement on issues like, are companies using carbon prices in making decisions, carbon accounting?
Right.
The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States, is in the process of issuing new regulations about disclosure of your carbon footprint. And I don't think I've seen very much coverage of that. And when there is coverage, you will almost always see a lot of discussion about how, they interview lots of companies who say, oh, it's going to cost us so much. And I think often less of an attention to the social impact of that kind of disclosure, or economic impact of that kind of disclosure, and why information of that kind is very important for our society.
That's a very fair point. And I think just as a member of the community, I would also take a second to give a hat tip to local journalists in terms of their role with climate coverage. Support your local journalists. That's really where stories sometimes come from. It's the first kernel of truth that is put out into the world saying, hey, something's not adding up over here. It looks like the pollutants are quite excessive. Is there a story to track? So I think local journalism plays a very big role. This is a good opportunity for me to bring in Amir Amel-Zadeh. He heads the Oxford Initiative on Rethinking Performance. He's been looking at climate for a long time and quite carefully. Welcome to the conversation, Amir. the same question in a different way to you. What ways do you think changing how we sort of measure the performance can address the threat of climate?
Well, thank you very much for bringing me in, and thank you for the comments. First of all, I agree that transparency is important, right? So transparency and disclosure of firms of their climate footprint is an important step forward, because it enables the stakeholders to essentially hold those companies to account. But I think there's two different aspects that we need to think about the disclosure. So one is, of course, the emissions themselves, so how much firms are contributing or what kind of impact they have on the climate, and that would enable maybe investors or other stakeholders to assess essentially the contribution that these companies make to climate change. But I think there's also the risk perspective, and Joseph, you mentioned essentially banking and the systemic risk that regulators are concerned about. So it can't get any more systemic than climate change, and that is an important aspect, I think, for investors also to understand what are essentially the systemic risks that they are facing in terms of the portfolio companies. And there it becomes a little bit more difficult, because I think traditional measures of how we think about risk, and we're talking about climate risk, don't apply here, because it's really uncertainty what we're talking about. So how can then companies disclose that kind of information and measure essentially the uncertainty? We're moving towards mitigation, adaptation, but I think there's an important step here that we need to think carefully about how we incentivize or maybe regulate companies to price in these externalities, but also then to disclose that in a form that is understandable for investors.
Thank you very much for that. And
Can I just make one comment
please,
about
go
that?
On.
And I want to highlight one aspect that it sort of reflects what happened in 2008. In 2008, we discovered that problems in one part of the financial system could quickly transmit to a systemic crisis. And that, Lehman Brothers going down led to problems with AIG, and then the whole system, we realized how fragile it was as a system. And the origins of that was problems in one part of the global financial system, America's lending in subprime mortgages.
Who would have heard that word?
Small part.
Yeah.
Now we're talking about, with climate change, a massive industry, fossil fuels, with massive amounts of stranded assets, which means that these are assets that in 2050, when we're back to net neutrality of zero, will have zero value or close to zero value. And today, they're very valuable. So sometime between now and then, the price is going to plummet. And that means that it's hard to believe that that won't have systemic effects. Now, it may go down gradually, and we may be able to manage it. This is called transition risk. But the markets often don't behave in that smooth way. And in financial markets, you have things like sudden stops, cross-border flows. So that transition risk is enormous, and is an example, just one aspect of climate risk, because there's also the physical risk of Florida is going to be underwater, or maybe DeSantis will sink. But
I can't imagine there's amusement at that thought, but good luck with reporting that.
So, but the point is that, hurricanes, lots of real estate is going to be problematic. And that means that anybody concerned with systemic risk, financial risk, ought to worry about climate change. And most of the central banks around the world, Mark Carney here took a very strong leadership role, have actually undertaken analysis of systemic risk. And one of the points that was just made was that individuals, companies can't really tell that systemic risk. They know their own risk, but they can't see, they have to see
What's
the whole
happening with the
thing
broad
of where
front.
they fit, how central they are in the financial system. And it's the obligation of the financial regulators, including the central banks, to do this. And a remarkable thing of the Federal Reserve is that it refuses to do that. Not a surprise given that he's a Trump appointee, but he was reappointed by Biden. And this to me is another example. You talk about credibility and accountability. People are not holding the Federal Reserve accountable.
Absolutely.
And so it's failed in regulation. Its monetary policy with respect to causing a global turmoil has been not ideal, and it's not addressing climate risk.
No, absolutely. And I was just going to say, I think one does need to sort of stress the importance of how what the Fed does is so pivotal to what happens with central banks across the world, and how they sort of follow the leader in that sense, really setting the tone for
It's more
many
than setting
parts.
the tone, because when they raise the interest rates, others have to follow. And so because if they don't, the exchange rates get out of line. Yeah. So it's not only, you might say, leadership, it's a major
Coerced
disturbance
leadership.
in the global financial markets.
Yeah, I'm conscious I've sort of cornered most of the conversation with you, so I'm going to open up for questions. And perhaps I might start with the cheekiest one, where there's no name with it, and I think I know your answer to this. Would you be in favor of introducing regulation that limits the ratio of pay between the highest and lowest earning in a company? For example, a CEO can't earn more than 10 times that of the lowest paid.
Well, I think having disclosure of those pay inequalities is very important. And understanding the structure of CEO pay. It's not just the level of the pay, but it's the determinants of the pay. So for instance, many CEOs get performance pay based on the profits. You ask the question, why should the CEO of Exxon get a bonus because Russia invades Ukraine and the price of oil goes up? It's, in my mind, outrageous that he's getting a bonus because of the Russia invasion. And that's what's happening in Exxon and most of the oil companies. So it's not only the level, but that you tie it to these things which are not a justifiable basis of any bonus. And this is a prevalent pattern, and it's been a pattern for almost a half a century. The caution I have in the simple regulation that you've described is that if you did a regulation like that, many companies would, quote, solve the problem by outsourcing janitorial services, outsourcing services that are low wage. So they would move them out of the company and say, oh, we're a company.
Starting from manager upwards.
Exactly. And everything else is some other company. So you have to be very sensitive to what we call industrial structure and how it can change with a regulatory framework of that kind.
There's another question from a journalist fellow this time, Natalia from Russia, who is a journalist fellow at the Reuters Institute, asks about the development of AI. I mean, what would a panel discussion be without an AI question? How much do you expect it to change the labor market and structure of global economies?
Well, it's clearly going to have, I think, a big impact. And how quickly is hard to tell. The early examples of large language models, the ChatGPT, are amusing. One of my students trained a a computer to be me.
Oh, no.
To see whether they could, make me redundant.
I can assure you, we wouldn't want to have a chat with a ChatGPT version of you.
The computer. So I gave it 10 questions. I don't know if you know what it means. You basically feed in a lot of data. They call it training data, so that it knows. It's supposed to know everything I've written, and therefore know what I would answer to a question. And it did remarkably well on 5 of the 10 questions that I gave it. And on those 5 questions, I think I was redundant. I would be a little bit better, but it was faster. So I thought it did very well. But then on a couple of them, it gave absolutely the wrong answer. And that was because it hadn't read or understood all the things I had written. And I hadn't said enough about those. So it didn't know the right answer, and it looked at more generally had been written.
Yeah.
And I was against what most people had said, but it didn't know that, and it gave absolutely the wrong opposite answer to the one So I have a few more years before I'm redundant, is what I've been convinced. But my friends in Silicon Valley do tell me that things are speeding up. I go to a conference in Silicon Valley every year into the heart of the belly of Facebook. So I get all the what's going on. Things are speeding up, but they still can't replace a lot of things. But radiologists, they can do the diagnosis better than any human. They don't have as much empathy in talking to the patient as telling him he's going to die, and they don't do it as empathetically as a good.
Symptoms seem to indicate.
Yeah. But I guess there are one worry that I do have is for developing countries, because where they are very effective is replacing routine behavior and routine analysis. And if you think, that's highly correlated with what we call unskilled labor, not completely, but highly correlated. And that means that these machines are so much faster than routine unskilled labor, that the developing countries and emerging markets that are not moving up the chain fast enough, I think are going to be facing a very difficult time.
Did we land on a B- for effort for your student? I'm curious to know what the grading was for that chat.
He says it's going to be better next time.
Oh, that's what they all say. Another question, this time from our Reuters fellow from Brazil, Felipe, who's working on a project around shifting baseline syndrome in newsrooms, and it's speaking to your points about climate. And he asks, what kind of economic structure would help us avoid making and creating income disparities between nations even wider because of climate change?
Well, I think, first, I think there needs to be much more of a global effort to deal with climate change, and with the economic consequences that the advanced countries have committed to providing $100 billion a year to help developing countries and emerging markets with mitigation, adaptation. And they haven't provided the money. So that overall framework, clearly they ought to at least live up to what they've already promised. I think that there are, okay, so one of the things that I've advocated is an annual emission of special drawing rights, the sort of money that the IMF creates, of the order of magnitude of, say, $300 billion a year to emerging markets and developing countries to help them deal with the problem of climate change, because it's going to be very difficult, particularly in the current context in the post-COVID world, to get governments to budget, the advanced countries' government to budget that amount. But we can do that through the IMF and these special drawing rights. I know, during COVID-19, the IMF issued $600 billion worth of SDRs. They were allocated in a way that was not optimal, according to the rules. But what is needed now is to do that every year, $300 billion a year. That would not be inflationary, but at the same time would give the developing countries and emerging markets a basis of resources to deal with climate change.
There's a specific question, if you'd like to take it, around the Wirecard scandal that was uncovered by the FT journalist and really highlighted the deficiencies in the auditing process. Would you say that's another space that is trying to be split up?
Well, it's clear that we've had one scandal after another in the accounting firms. One of the reasons there's only four is that one of them disappeared after, I think it was the Enron.
I think it was Enron.
Enron scandal. We have three major rating agencies, and we saw during the 2008 crisis, they didn't do a very good job, and a couple of them were accused of fraud. And I don't know if there was ever a conviction, but I do know, because I was involved in one of these suits, that there were settlements where they were sued for that, and money was paid so it wouldn't go to trial. And so I think these are both areas where there's a natural conflict of interest. That is to say, the company is paying the rating agency, and it's not a surprise that the rating agency has a tendency to give you a good grade if it'd be like our getting paid directly bribed by our students to give a good grade. I mean, it's the way our system works. Yeah. And I think that clearly we need to have in areas where they're critical role, like in banking, we can't rely on private supervision. And we've gone to public supervision as the right solution. Yeah. Now, in all these other areas, I don't think we can go all the way to public supervision, but we need to have a much tighter public supervision of the supervisors, i.e. of the rating agencies and the accounting firms.
Let me ask you a more personal question, perhaps, Joseph, for the generational spectrum we have in this room and maybe outside of this room as well. For many of the young working population, they either came in through the process of college education or other skilling in the period of the global financial crisis. They entered an extremely fractured work market. Many of them went on to see this serial sort of mass layoffs and wave after wave of that, and are still living in a very difficult environment. I mean, many young people in the UK, for example, spend most of their salary just in paying rent, and then they spend the rest of it on traveling from one place to the other. What would you say to tell them there's reason for hope?
Hope. Well, no, So the basic thing, and the basis of hope is actually, it may sound strange, but our scientific advances. You know, we know so much more, not about economics, but about the world in a very, that our technological advances have been amazing. And what does that mean? That means that if we organize our society better, we should be able to have higher standards of living. And we could all have basically a higher standards of living. So the challenge is, to me, that how do we translate these scientific advances into widespread prosperity and balance, yeah. And you know, it may mean that we decide as part of our society that we want to have more leisure, like the French enjoy more leisure. We may want to, some people may want to have more consumer goods, so long as it doesn't impose costs on the environment. But the problem is, it goes back, that I think failures in our economic and social system. So we have this really strong advances in science and technology that have not been really brought together with the appropriate, I might say, advances in social and economic and political organization. And so the disparity, we might say the hope is that we can bring those two into better balance. And if we did that, then I think we could actually all have higher standards of living.
As they say, we live in hope.
Yeah.
I am conscious that Amir has a chat to have with all of you, but I think I might have 30 seconds to squeeze this one in, because I saw this question and I thought I'd steal it and tweak it both, and it was asked of you. If you were to invite 3 outstanding individuals to dinner, and these would be 3 journalists, alive or dead, who would you pick?
Oh, that's a high. I mean, one of the things about journalists, I'm not trying to. You said 3 journalists.
I said 3 journalists, and I'm wondering if I should backtrack.
So I was going to say the thing about journalists is they're actually very good in dinner conversation. And I don't mean that in just flattery, because they do think about things in a broad way if they're doing their job well. And you know, obviously I'm a little biased because my wife used to be a journalist. Okay. So I would obviously invite her.
We can strike one off the list.
So obviously she's one that there are a lot of others whose writing I like. We were talking before about Gideon Rachman as being somebody who's really interesting. One of your colleagues who just joined you here at Oxford, Gillian Tett, is always very interesting, and Rana Furrier, who's from Indiana, I don't know if you knew that, is also. So there, you know, I find it difficult actually to who are my favorite 3.
That's excellent. We're at 4.
Other than my wife.
Yeah, I was going to say we're at 4, so we can always pull an extra chair up. Journalists accommodate that space for each other. Please join me in lending a very, very warm round of applause to Professor Stiglitz for his time today. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you. And perhaps as we make our way off stage, I'd like to invite Amir, who's going to come and have a chat about Rethinking Performance Initiative, and we'd love to hear more from you, Amir. Come on over. I think we can start making our way down. We can make our way.
Well, what a pleasure to be here. And speaking of tough shoes to fill, no pressure here. Well, welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to speak at this event. And what I would really like to speak about to you about in the next 30 minutes or so is really about a fundamental reshaping of capitalism. And that's currently ongoing. And that creates the demand for new research, for high-quality journalism, for new innovative ideas, and how we should rethink, how we should extend, how we should reshape, how we perhaps should revolutionize how we measure economic performance, and how it impacts everything from how we make investment decisions, how we allocate capital, and how we incentivize ourselves as economic actors in doing what we're doing best. But let me start from the beginning. It was a powerful idea. It all starts always with a powerful idea. And this idea goes back to essentially the 18th century and maybe even before then. And it's to a large extent attributed to Adam Smith. And of course you know this. And his notion of the invisible hand. Even though his views were a bit more nuanced than how he usually is quoted. But generally, the idea was that even if everyone acts in their own self-interest, each individually, everyone is better off as a society. So somehow, miraculously, everyone is better off because through trade, we will essentially share the spoils of production. And I know I'm walking on thin ice having preeminent economists here, so let me translate that into what economists usually talk about, is essentially that in a competitive economy, it is ensured that essentially we get to what they call Pareto optimal solution, where essentially everyone is better off, or at least one person is better off and no one is worse off. And which essentially means if everyone strives to maximize profits, then this will also lead to a socially optimal outcome for everyone. Now, of course, underlying this notion, there's several, some might say, heroic assumptions, right? And these are essentially that everyone acts rationally, although we can relax that assumption and it will not change that much from the conclusions. But then more importantly, that everything is priced through a competitive market and through a complete market, and that everyone has access to the same information. And many Nobel Prize-winning ideas and research, including by Joseph as well, have relaxed these assumptions and essentially have investigated what the consequences are. Now, the beauty of this idea, though, is it is simple, right? It allows us to optimize all our activities through one single measure, profits. Now, how astonishing the outcome of this idea was, shows you this graph. Profit has been the engine for prosperity, right? It's astonishing how powerful this idea has been in organizing our economic activity. And this graph really tells it all, right? Although to be more precise, I should maybe plot GDP per capita. That shows you total GDP, but it would essentially look the same. Now, it's undeniable that society has benefited, right, from and prospered collectively, and that we're better off even if we just look at 50 years ago. Now, of course, that doesn't really tell us anything about how the wealth that is being created has been distributed. But that's not the only issue. Now, I can't really talk about profits without mentioning another Nobel Prize-winning economist. But I come to this. Because one vehicle that really allowed us to channel capital towards the most profitable resources has been the modern corporation. Right? The essentially assembly of common interests and maybe limited liability to take risks to essentially channel resources, allocate resources, that organizing principle that allowed this to do. And you can't really talk about this without mentioning Milton Friedman, of course, who in an op-ed in the New York Times, which has been widely cited, of course, and commented that essentially the only And the social, or the only responsibility, the social responsibility of business is only to increase its profits. Right? Now, this commentary was essentially a response, really, to growing calls at that time where essentially academics and civil society have implored businesses to address some of society's problems. But Milton Friedman essentially responded, this is not the job that corporations, shareholders should do, because corporations are good in maximizing profits, and that automatically will increase social welfare. Now, of course, if there are so-called externalities or issues with that, where corporations impose problems or costs on others, then we should have governments to come in and maybe tax or have regulation to essentially bound what corporations can do. Now, and the argument that he really brings is, and this is a powerful argument, is that if shareholders wanted to essentially benefit society, they can do that themselves. Take the profits that you reap from your investments in corporations and then do whatever you want to do with it. Now there's some assumptions here that might be problematic, and I'll come back to this in a second. Because one might think, one might say, this might have been a flawed idea. Maybe I would rather say it's been some flawed assumptions. Because we know that markets are imperfect, and then governments are unable, or sometimes even maybe unwilling, to address these societal problems or externalities that we create in the pursuit of profits. And this is something, this is something that was the underlying assumption under Milton Friedman's essentially arguments that he couldn't really foresee, right? And what he couldn't foresee is the sheer size of corporations as we know them today. With that size comes power, comes political power, comes economic power. So really, an individual shareholder cannot address some of the externalities maybe as efficiently as a corporation could do with the size that they have. Nor even if they wanted to, might they even be able to do this. If you think of, say, remedying pollution that you as a shareholder essentially also calls investing in, say, carbon-intensive companies, how will you actually remedy this? Would it not be easier for the company themselves to come to invest into solutions? So these are essentially arguments. Now, what are the externalities? Well, Joseph has mentioned a few. Climate change, of course. But these externalities are really vast, they're destructive, they are unfair, and ultimately, as with climate change, they can be existential. Now, our capitalism model has essentially delivered us with immense gains and prosperity, right? And at the same time has been a source of environmental degradation, has been a source of biodiversity loss, the changing climate, and social inequalities. But to be fair to Adam Smith, at that point in time, that wasn't a problem. There was no problem with environmental issues. So we have to be fair. And so this obviously, and he acknowledged social inequalities in essentially his treatise, right? But now it's being increasingly acknowledged by academia, in journalism, in reporting, in essentially civil society, but also now increasingly so in business and in financial markets, that these externalities impose a problem, so that we have an issue. Now, what has been the response? So the response has been coming from all directions. One is from my colleague and the actual founder or initiator of this initiative that we are now part of, Professor Colin Mayer, who is emeritus now, who essentially came up with a normative idea, right? And this normative idea was the purpose of business and its role in society should change, right? We should change it. So it cannot be about maximizing profits. And he says essentially the purpose of a company is to produce profitable solutions. So there's still in the notion that it has to be profitable, because otherwise the company cannot exist. But it has to provide solutions to problem of people and planet, and not to create or produce these problems to people and planet. Now, this is a normative, essentially, call for action. The question now, of course, is why should things change, right? Why should companies react to this? And actually, do they? So we can actually come to a positive, essentially positivist assessment of this. And you only have to look into, and I just took 3 companies here as an example. You can go through other corporations' websites and get their purpose statements. Now look at this on the right side here. Energy company, our purpose is to reimagine the energy for people and our planet. We want to help the world reach net zero and improve people's lives. A consumer goods company, we are driven by our purpose to make sustainable living commonplace. Or pharmaceutical companies, we are focused on accelerating delivery of life-changing medicines that create enduring value for patients, society, and our shareholders. You read these purpose statements, you might think these are charitable institutions. Right. Now, of course, you will say, well, words are cheap. Right? Everyone can say this. But words are also powerful, and you can be held to account for saying what you're saying. And these are publicly announced. I'll come back to this notion. But let's look on the right side. So you can argue, well, these are European firms, UK-based. Obviously, we know that maybe we're more attuned to these issues than maybe in North America, so the bastion of capitalism. On the right-hand side, the Business Roundtable is essentially akin to the voice of US corporation CEOs. So this is the Business Roundtable, is a roundtable of a large number of CEOs in the US. They came out in 2019 with a statement on purpose. That statement on purpose used to include for a long time, for decades, only one sentence. Essentially, the purpose is the company should maximize profits or shareholder value as the fiduciaries of shareholders' money. Now, in 2019, this is the purpose, the new purpose. We share a fundamental commitment to all our stakeholders. And then they list, we commit to delivering value to our customers, to investing in our employees, to fostering diversity and inclusion, to dealing fairly and ethically with our suppliers, to supporting the communities by enhancing sustainable practices, protect the environment, and then also, last point, generating long-term value for shareholders. Now you can see, there's no ranking here. Everything is mentioned equally. And then at the end, each of our stakeholders is essential. We commit to deliver value to all of them. So something is changing, even in the US. Something is changing. Now again, these are words, but words matter. And words matter. Why words matter, we can see from this. Investors are putting increasing pressure on companies because this is becoming transparent, because they're making these statements. In the US, you can go to a chemical company that now investors want to know, okay, how exactly, what is your pollution? So what is the waste that you're creating, and how are you actually addressing this? Investors want to know more about modern slavery and supply chains. They want to know about systemic externalities, obesity, and they want companies to address these things. Consumer goods companies. Some investors, who one might argue are normally associated with hard-driven maximizing shareholder value, even care about pigs. Now, there is increasing pressure, right, on companies, and this is what is increasingly happening. Now, you can think of, well, on the one hand, we might actually be able to reconcile this with shareholder value maximization, with profit maximization. Because you might argue, they're not doing this for the good of the planet. They're doing this because they think this will affect shareholder values. And this might be right? And this could be. But then the argument has to go further than this and has to say, well, why didn't they do this before? Why is it now? Right? So either then these externalities have not really been priced in before in markets, or there has been some inefficiency, or they now are aware that these are going to be priced in somehow through maybe regulators stepping in or taxing polluting companies or others. On the other hand, and this is a new idea that is coming out prominently from the University of Chicago, Luigi Zingal is mentioning that, well, actually, this shows us that shareholders do care about other things than profits. Shareholders are people, and we have feelings, and we don't want to be associated with profiting from slavery, for example. We feel bad. So it's not about shareholder value maximization, it's maybe about shareholder welfare maximization. We want to feel good, this is monetary, but also non-pecuniary. So maybe that we have to change the way we essentially formulate our optimization problem and the system itself and what we measure. But it's also shareholders that is changing, and this goes back to the first point, is yes, we can to some extent reconcile this with profit maximization, and this is Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, sending out his annual letters to his investee companies talking about purpose and profit, and he really highlights here in the first sentence that we focus on sustainability not because we are environmentalists, but because we are capitalists and fiduciary to our clients. So this is the essentially view that these externalities, the impact of businesses on the climate, on society, ultimately affects their profitability at some point or already does so. So hence, as an investor, you have to take that into account. You would violate your fiduciary duty if you didn't. Look, and why is that the case? And this graph here on the right, I'll explain, comes from joint work that I'm currently doing with one of our PhD students, Fiona Kasbeck, and my colleague Martin Schmalz in finance, where we look at the ownership of companies, and this is for the ownership of the S&P 500, and we see a dramatic rise in what you can call universal ownership. So this ownership that investors essentially hold shares in all companies across the market, so they're becoming universal owners, and common ownership, and this is within a sector, that also increasingly investors not only hold one company in one sector, but all of the companies in one particular sector. So what does that mean? Well, if you're a universal owner, you are exposed to, you care about the externalities that one firm imposes on another firm in another sector. Right? You care about climate change because you're exposed to climate change no matter what. You care about whether an energy company imposes externalities on a real estate company in your portfolio because you hold the entire market. Yeah. So these externalities seem to matter because the nature of ownership is changing. Now, what are we talking about? And this is where the problem becomes and starts to become really complex. Because we're deviating from one measure that we can use, maximizing shareholder value, to having to think about a wide variety of issues, not only environmental, so not only climate change, waste management, you name it, also fair labor practices on product liabilities, inequality, and then, of course, governance issues around corruption that was mentioned, business conduct and business failure, and corporate governance as a whole. So this just shows you the complexity, and now the question is how can we rethink how companies essentially integrate these issues into a performance measure? Can it be one? Should it be multiple? And how do we then actually hold companies to account? Now, lots has been said about climate change, and the challenges are tremendous, and the risks are tremendous, right? And these risks are not going away, and hence managers, CEOs have to think about these, because irrespective of whether we actually manage to mitigate the effects, so then we would be somewhere down here on a pathway, say 1.5 degree pathway, or even if you don't do anything, and we see rapid rises in temperatures, companies are going to be exposed to risks. It's either going to be the physical risks from climate change, so changing essentially weather patterns that will create havoc to supply chains and others. Or it's going to have to be a dramatic change in how we do business, for some sectors more so than others. So complete rethink of business models to put us on that path, which then we would call transition risk. Right? So there's a massive, and then the question is this going to be an orderly transition? The more we delay the transition, the more unorderly it's going to get, and the more severe the effects. So irrespective, there's risks that need to be taken into account, and investors want companies to do this. This is coming from work that I've done previously with BNY Mellon in trying to get a sense of what these risks are. What do investors think these risks are, and what do companies actually think? And they're very different, they're very diverse. So it goes from what Joseph Stiglitz also said around stranded assets, that essentially you lose your license to operate as a business, you can't use assets, extract energy from the ground, that you expose to litigation risk, to a regulatory risk. But also, from the company's perspective, the demand is changing. You and I are changing our consumption patterns because exactly we don't want to be associated with modern slavery. So these are all factors that play into account, either now already in essentially our traditional profit measure, or will have to be taken into account through some other way in business decisions and how investors make decisions. But it's not all gloom and doom. There's also tremendous opportunities for investors and businesses. This is from research from colleagues in Oxford. This is from journalism, essentially, showing you essentially the tremendous investments coming into renewable energies and energy transition technologies. And on the right-hand side, so this is so far, and on the right-hand side, depending on what climate model you're essentially, or what temperature you're essentially targeting, this shows you in billion US dollars, the investment needs annually that need to be done into transition technologies to achieve that. So there's tremendous opportunity. So businesses not only think about this from a risk perspective, but there's also from an opportunity, and obviously opportunity for innovation and investment. Now with all this, we are trying to respond to this. And this is where our Oxford initiative of Rethinking Performance comes in, where we're trying to respond to this by looking at how we can help society, how we can help businesses, investors, to make sense of this all, and essentially provide research, provide rigorous academic research, and collaborate them. And we do this, we're trying to break this problem down, because this is immense. The problem is immense, and of course, one initiative, and there's many, cannot address this alone. But we're trying to break this down in terms of thinking about purpose and strategy, right? So even if you say, okay, yes, I believe in the normative aspects, the Colin Mayer's essentially push to companies to changing their purpose, then what does that mean? It's a very vague idea, but how do you actually operationalize this in your business model? What do you have to do? Who do you have to talk to? What are who do you have to align as a stakeholders? Do you have to get your shareholders on board if you change your purpose? What does it actually mean? How do you measure this? Then that brings us to essentially, how do you account for all this? Because we know only what gets measured will get done, will get managed. So we need to account for externalities. We need to find measures for these externalities. We need to report, not only report on the negative, but also on the positive impacts that a company can have. And then we need to understand how investors react to this, how financial markets incorporate this information into their investment decisions. Because ultimately, we want to still have the price signal as essentially the allocating mechanism to essentially channel funds into the most productive resources, and the productive resources here being encompassing all essentially effects, including all externalities that companies have. So we want to essentially provide prosperity without damaging the planet. Now let me show you a couple of examples of what we do and then close. So on operationalizing purpose, we're essentially working with organizations, two large international corporations actually, in different sectors, in trying to understand, okay, what kind of hurdles do they have to overcome? and what are essentially the strategic and the operational challenges that they are facing in trying to align the organization. This comes from the internal organization. You can think that even within an organization, if you have employees that are really aligned with this idea, you will still have essentially major hurdles that you're facing in pushing the entire organization to really buy into this. There's people that might not buy into this, so you need to really align everyone. How do you do this? Because you're really changing your business model. You're really changing what you do. If you're an energy company and you were extracting oil, it was very profitable, everyone was receiving big bonuses, you're now changing to renewable energy. The return on renewable energy is significantly lower than it is on fossil fuels. So which means lower profitability, which might need retooling of employees as well, and so on. So there's massive consequences for employees. So how do you do this? But not only internal stakeholders are at stake, but also external stakeholders. You have to align how you work with governments, civil society, other stakeholders, your investors, and so on. So how can you do this? And we're working with one organization to think about how they can decarbonize essentially their business model along those lines, having to essentially bring everyone in particular their supply chain, because most of their carbon emissions is coming from their supply chain. So if they don't align their stakeholders, their suppliers, they will not bring down their carbon emissions. So they need to be the ones who are orchestrating, who are pressuring the supply chain to essentially change. On measurement and impact, and we have done several studies, and there are several studies ongoing, it's really about, if you do all this as an organization, what is the impact? What is the impact on essentially your finances, right? So what is ultimately the financial impact of doing so? You're shifting a business model. But also, do you actually have a positive impact doing so, or do you reduce your negative impact on society and the environment? You need to measure this to be able to assess whether shifting your purpose was actually useful. Right? Otherwise, are you just destroying value? So we need to really be able to measure this. And then the problem comes, what are reliable measures? They can vary from company to company. They can vary across industries. And this is something that not only us, of course, but also standard setters are looking into, and other organizations overall. So then ultimately, what investors are really concerned about is, what does it mean for us, right? Do we have to pay for this? I.e., do we now have to essentially consider that we destroy financial value because we're investing it in societal or environmental value? And then we're working with a couple of large asset managers, international asset managers, for example, on trying to measure investments in human capital, so into training, retooling, innovation, and how that translates, what kind of measures what is essentially a return on human capital investment, and how does that link to investment performance in a portfolio where you essentially invest more into companies that are investing more into their employees? What are the effects of regulation? Most of you might know that Europe is essentially spearheading a big regulatory drive, in particular, essentially saying how and what is considered sustainable as a business activity, and then how funds that want to market themselves as sustainable can essentially have to then invest in particular companies. If you're that rigorous, does that actually really move the dial and push you into a direction that funds are actually being channeled into the more sustainable resources? Or are companies gaming the system? Or is this essentially misallocating funds? So there's a lot of research that needs to be done. And of course, whether there is a premium to investing sustainably overall. So lots to do in terms of research, but also, of course, lots to write about and really investigate about how companies are doing this. And as researchers, we rely a lot on what we call anecdotal evidence in the press, because that gives us ideas of what to look into, but also informs us of where the problems might lie and who to talk to. So thank you very much, and look forward to speaking to you all.
Amir, thank you very much indeed. I hope the mic's working. Is the mic working? Somebody nod at me. Yes, good. So I'm delighted to say that my role is simply to say thank you and direct you to the coffee and other delights awaiting you in the reception area. But I do just want to close by saying how honoured we are to host such important and interesting conversations here at the Business School. I'd like to thank my colleagues from the Reuters Institute, Mitali in particular, and of course I'd like to thank Joseph Stiglitz, who has made the start of this conversation, this lunchtime, so stimulating, and Amir for ending with that discussion about purpose. And I think if we have done anything today, we have really questioned ourselves about the role of academics, of journalists, of business people, of policymakers in creating resilience. Resilience for us as consumers, resilience for us as leaders in businesses and in society as a whole. We know we can be resilient. We know that we have failed to be resilient, and we all have a duty to think about that and act on it in future. And finally, before the coffee, we have learned that ChatGPT has not yet made a Nobel Prize-winning economist completely redundant. So with that note, I would like to say thank you, and I look forward to talking with some of you in the reception area. Thank you very much.